Today's agenda is to look at what the role of innovation is in developing national or even subnational policies to address low emissions development. The question always arises is why are we concerned about green growth or green policy, and why are we concerned about innovation? What do the two have to do with each other? Wouldn't it be fine just to do standard regulations to address our environmental issues and then think about economic policy differently? And the response to that is that integrating these two approaches to energy is actually a way that we can imagine solving a number of different development problems simultaneously. And that's what I'd like to talk with you all about today. For some of the motivation here, I'm going to refer to one of the headline dimensions of the recent Rio Plus 20 meeting in Rio de Janeiro, 20 years after the first Rio meeting, which articulated a vision of the next stage of sustainable development, where we're imagining sustainable development not simply as a way to control sort of our resource use and ensure that there's good development without using too much resource, but rather recasting that and embracing development as an economic agenda, but building in energy, environmental health. So as this quote says, sustainable development emphasizes, in the words of the conference organizer, or the outcomes document, a holistic, equitable, and far-sighted approach to decision making. And the idea that the integration, as you can see there, it rests on the integration and balanced consideration of social, economic, and environmental goals and objectives in both public and private decision making. And what I'm going to talk about today is a way that we can imagine via policy, via stakeholder engagement at the national or subnational levels, incorporating this idea of growth and innovation as part of the development agenda. Okay, here's one of the challenges in some ways of thinking about this new approach to sustainable development. We are consistently always looking for ways to decouple environmental impacts from economic growth. And by decoupling, I simply mean to enable the economy to grow, to enable services, whether they're lighting services, energy services, transportation services, to be more widely available and available in higher quantities without the kinds of environmental impacts that we've seen from the existing energy infrastructure. And what I'm showing here is trends in the OECD, showing GDP, that's the top curve there that you can see in the figure, as well as municipal waste generation, energy supply, non-energy material consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions. And the interesting thing here, of course, is that GDP, you can see there's a slight dip with the global economic crisis of the last few years. But for the most part, GDP has grown substantially faster than all of these other essentially environmental, the burdens of the economy from the operation of the economy in municipal waste, energy supply, material consumption, and greenhouse gases. And it's that kind of decoupling, that kind of moving away from a lockstep where we expand GDP only by expanding energy supply. That's where the green growth and innovation agenda lies. So here are just 4 ways that we can imagine this might happen over the coming decade or 2 decades. Now, there's different kinds of innovation. We'll talk about that in other parts of the seminar today. But broadly speaking, some of the most near-term useful kinds of innovations are new and perhaps cheap applications of existing technologies, taking ideas that already exist out in the public domain, repackaging them for a local context, and then being able to market those technologies to essentially a wide, perhaps lower margin, but a wide array of consumers. Is one example there, and I'll talk about this later, but the flex fuel car, which can burn ethanol or gasoline. The technology existed for 60 or 70 years before it actually entered into widespread use. The place that it entered into widespread use was Brazil. Brazil had an existing ethanol infrastructure. They were able to take the flex fuel vehicle technology, bring it to market, and there was essentially a widespread market uptake and huge success to the point where in the span of 7 or 8 years, the quantity of flex fuel vehicles increased from 0% in roughly 2003 to above 90% today. Using old ideas in a new context, integrating several existing technologies to serve an under-tapped market, or even using new business models to provide services, business models that might, in fact, be enabled by new applications of information technology or distributed phone use or something like this. Here's one example of a repackaging of existing technologies for a particular goal. LEDs, light-emitting diodes, are a very low-energy form, a way to produce light. They're more efficient than even compact fluorescents, probably about 10 times more efficient than our standard incandescent lights that existed 20 or 30 years ago. And one of the ideas with this particular technology that you're looking at on your screen is that by repackaging LEDs with a very inexpensive solar recharge, very inexpensive battery, in a robust and very durable package, you could actually make a rechargeable lighting source that could be distributed out into rural areas that were in fact off-grid, which didn't have a lot of existing electricity supply infrastructure, and bring lighting services to places that didn't have them already. This would be areas around the world, populations that essentially would not have access to light after dark. This is very helpful for something like development outcomes on education and so on. So that's one example. And here I'm going to give you another example. Often when we think about innovation, I gave you the example of the repackaging of existing technologies. Here's an example that is a business model example. As we know, certain kinds of technologies are highly advanced, and those kinds of technologies tend to be very expensive in the early stages. There are a couple of kind of business models that can be used to advance the kind of cutting-edge technology. One of them I show here, which is on the left. This is the Tesla Roadster. The Tesla is a very advanced battery electric vehicle. It's very high-tech. It uses the more advanced battery technology. It's generally high cost, and it targets a small and essentially rich market. They're targeting very high margin consumers, very high wealthy consumers, like the guy you see driving the vehicle there. Basically, the cars are extremely expensive, and their business model is that they want to sell a few very expensive cars and use that to build out their technology to the point where they can bring down costs, make it increasingly accessible to lower and lower income bracket users. So they're starting at the top and they're working down. There's another approach, though, to doing technology innovation, thinking about batteries. This is a picture of some of you may be intimately familiar with, but in some parts of the world, not Washington, D.C. right now where I'm sitting, but in some parts of the world, electric scooters are in fact one of the fastest growing modes of transportation. Electric scooters that are not using the most advanced batteries, they're not targeting the highest margin customers, they're essentially targeting people that need to get to work, and that the cleanliness of the product is essentially almost a byproduct of the fact that it gets you from here to there in a relatively inexpensive way. Now, these electric vehicles are using relatively old technology, they're repackaging old technology, and they're pioneering dimensions of battery recharge systems. So basically the question is, how do you recharge a battery? Do you actually plug it in and let it sit for 6 hours, or do you swap it out with a substitute? And these electric scooters are actually pioneering this alternate business model of essentially renting batteries or swapping out recharged batteries. It's a new model that hadn't been used before, but this is the kind of innovation. I think we need to label it as an innovation that is something that can drive technological change. Because the question is, which of these two will push battery technology forward? And the answer is they both do, right? One of them pushes technology forward at the very high end. The other is very effective at addressing a large number of people, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of customers, pushing the costs of that technology down for the kind of more general use. Another question arises with innovation is that sometimes we think about innovation being something with a very long-term payoff. And if you think about innovation in both of these ways, it is true that Tesla is an interesting model and may provide a new kind of inexpensive and perhaps technically superior battery down the road in 5 or 10 years, maybe 15 years for general use. But the one that's providing benefits now is the lower cost one. It's the repackaged system that's experiencing innovation on the business side, innovation on the marketing side. Okay, so one question that arises with this concept of innovation for green technologies is what the role of government is, and that's a healthy debate to have. There is one side that it's a spectrum, and there's always kind of a mix of perspectives on this question. But the general issue is that in any kind of technology that has a benefit, a broader benefit to society, in this case, we might think of energy access being a benefit, we might think of broader economic growth being a benefit, we might think of less environmental damage being a benefit. If those benefits are not priced by the current market structure, in other words, if there's an externality in the economic term, we would expect that those kinds of innovations would not be pursued as aggressively as if the externality were already priced in. And this is often the situation we deal with when we're talking about green technologies or low emissions kinds of technologies. Whether it's the small scale technology like that battery, the battery, solar, and LED flashlight, or whether it's really large scale technologies like carbon capture and storage, or next generation ethanol, something that's sort of big energy. Whether small or big energy, if the externalities aren't priced, we wouldn't expect to get as much innovation on those technologies as we would if it were priced. So the question then becomes, if we're not going to change the world in terms of the price of these externalities, which in the near term in some countries it just may not be feasible in your local situation in the U.S. right now, for example, there's just not the prospect of a pricing system for carbon. So that changes what we have as a policy, a set of policy options. But the government can do a lot, even in the face of not being able to price the externalities. The whole idea is that there is some kind of market failure that provides a rationale of sorts for some kind of policy. We can talk about what those policies would be in the coming slides. When we think about policy for energy now we're thinking at generally the domestic, national level context. If we're looking at energy policy, the motivations for thinking about energy policy usually have fallen into roughly four dimensions, four categories, which I show here in this slide, these interlinked dimensions of energy policy. So we have energy access, making sure that all people in the population have some access to clean or available energy to do the work that they need to do in their lives. Energy security, an issue that touches on a lot of government concern about whether there are going to be reliable sources of supply for all the kinds of energy that are used in a national system. That could be fossil, that could be hydro, that could be biofuels, it could be any number of technologies. But the idea of energy security, that a country isn't very dependent on other countries, often raises its head in terms of energy policy. Economic growth is obviously a key motivation for almost all national governments. How can we encourage economic growth? And that's usually a top-line concern of the government. Energy is often seen as an input to economic growth. That's why energy security is important. That's potentially why environmental impact is important. But economic growth can be seen even more broadly. As I mentioned in my introductory comments, it's possible that energy can be a source of economic growth. Certain countries are pursuing, in fact, industrial and economic policies that are oriented at export markets. And I think here, for example, Korea. There's many of them. I just use one example, but Korea with its green growth strategy, thinking about nuclear, wind, solar as export commodities, not simply something that's focused on just securing domestic supply. And I should say before I went on, the fourth one, which is also on there, I mentioned environmental damage, and climate change is a sort of special case of environmental damage, one that might be seen, it manifests in different ways, but is certainly part of the overall global challenge of tackling energy. The question then arises, I presented four goals, these four dimensions of energy policy, and the question always arises, well, what's the best approach to tackle these? Is it to sort of think about long-term energy strategy? Maybe we'll solve the climate change problem later and deal with our economic problems now. That's one way to do it. But I think that the most creative and the most sort of likely to hit all of our development and economic goals at one time, is to think about doing this four-part approach to achieving the energy goals. Thinking about the linked areas of energy innovation, by which I mean thinking of new and less expensive technologies, new markets, developing new markets, opening new markets, and also thinking about that longer-term innovation that I mentioned earlier. Implementation, so taking technologies that we have now on the shelf, figuring out a way to get the policy to encourage those technologies to come off the shelf and into general use. Integration, thinking of not only specific technologies like just wind turbines, or thinking of things like batteries or battery electric vehicles and smart grids as independent entities, but thinking about how those technologies work with each other. So instead of individual atomistic approach, thinking about, for example, how might intermittent renewables in a future world combine with people's battery electric vehicles and a smart grid to create some kind of distributed storage system in the car batteries of people's vehicles, right? So there's ways to think about integrating new technologies that go beyond the models that we currently use and might in fact enable a different approach to delivering the energy security and the energy services that we want in the future. And the upshot of all of this is that it's possible then, with the combination of these three approaches, to think about transforming our energy system to one that is less dirty, is more economically sound, is more profitable, and in fact has greater access and benefits to all parts of domestic populations. Okay. This is an overly complicated figure that I'm going to just refer you to the references if you wish. But this is one conception of how, remember at the beginning I said innovation happens, but it has to happen in the wider context. So this is one more holistic way of thinking about innovation, thinking about encouraging different dimensions of the innovation chain simultaneously. So thinking on the left, you see regional science foundations, that's building out, say, for example, domestic science and technology capacity, thinking about then business, thinking about the entrepreneurial culture and nurturing that via, for example, business incubators. And then finally, a more familiar approach, thinking about de-risking investment. This might be something that the World Bank would do or something that might be done on a bilateral basis. So in conclusion, it's important to remember that these transformative innovations that may not be happening all from the kind of high developed country, very high tech labs, right? The transformative innovations may be the ones that are essentially repackaged existing innovations that are going to a completely new market, a market that's only understood by people who, for example, live in the area that they're working in. And it's very important, it's essential for this 20 to 30 year timeline to think about how those innovations can go from the kind of entrepreneur's concept to expand into this new market. And it's the role of governments around the world to think about their own context, their own development context. What is missing from their development context? Is it regulated? Is it the regulatory environment? Is it the IP environment? Is it the lack or presence of standards? Or is it other kinds of national priorities that are just articulated out into the country that can encourage these kinds of innovations to spread more widely and be nurtured in the domestic context?